Hello out there, all my bookish friends in BookTube land, and welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this video, we're taking a look at 11, I know it's an unusual number, books that shaped the Western world, and by extension, the global world. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? I do want to say right up front that I'm very well aware that there are more than 11 books that shaped the world, or shaped the Western world in particular. But I've picked these because they are significant in the development of thought and of society as we know it today. And if you enjoy this video, by all means leave me a comment and I'll do another video on other great works that actually shape the world we inhabit. Not just good in our field, but the way we think, the way we behave, the way society is structured, that's what these books are going to involve. And to be honest, if you wanted to read them, a lot of them are very dry books, so I wouldn't necessarily say go and read them, but only if you have a special interest in them. However, it's good to get a little bit of background on what each one is. So, let's start. The first book up, in some respects, has had one of the greatest influences in the world at large, like the world as a whole, and it's Euclid's Elements. We're going right back to antiquity, the Greek geometrician and mathematician Euclid. He's called the father of geometry, and in his work, The Elements, he lays out a few axioms and ideas for basing an understanding of geometry, including in one of the chapters, I think it's the second chapter, he concludes at the end with establishing the golden ratio that's been used in architecture, building and art. But his understanding, although this criticised later, it's Euclidean mathematics or geometry that lasted right up to the 19th century as the main underpinning of mathematics. And of course there are other works in that time, loads of massive works, but Euclid is, you could almost say, is the rock bed of geometry as we know it today, and so therefore has influenced the entire world that you see around you. The way it's structured, the way it's laid out, the way things are built, uses this mathematics. And to think, he didn't come up with it all on his own, he used various people around him, other Greek mathematicians, but the way he brought it all together under his way of seeing it was a miracle for one man to do that. And I'm pretty rubbish at maths, to be quite honest, so it baffles me when someone's just decent at maths. But to come up with an entire field that would last thousands of years is an absolute remarkable achievement. Our next book is also from the antiquity, from Greece, and it's Plato's The Republic. This sort of sets the ball rolling in a very detailed and rational process of trying to construct the perfect society, or at least the best society possible. And what Plato does, he doesn't look at the whole world, he looks at the city-state and how it could be arranged to get the maximum benefit for everybody. The ideas in the Republic are fascinating because there are constant through the West, there are constant iterations on the fundamental ideas of the Republic. And when we think of the Renaissance, which gave birth to a great deal of thought, and government obviously is part of that, philosophy, they had a fascination with the Greeks, and so Plato's resurrected influence comes to bear. Plato's basic idea, and I'm really dumbing it down here, is that the perfect city-state should be broken into three sectors. So at the bottom you've got the producers, and then you have what's called the auxiliaries, and then you have the guardians. And the way he lays this out, he says everybody has sort of gravitates towards a certain skill. And so from birth, children should be watched to see what they become good at. And if you're good at becoming baking and creating food, then you will take on the role of being a baker in the city-state. Because you're good at it, it's going to benefit most others, and there's a good chance you're going to enjoy doing it. But you never change your position in your life. This is one of the criticisms that comes in later. If you're good at pot making, then you become a potter. If you're a blacksmith that you're good at, great, do that. The auxiliaries are a group taken from the producers who, from the early age, they have a certain sense of leadership quality, but not the highest philosopher level. And they're going to be trained, they're they're the ones that are very physical. This can include women as well. And their job is to guard the city-state, because as it produces and becomes more luxurious because of the way it's organised, other states will want to come in and take what they've made. So we need the people who protect the city. He would call these the auxiliaries. And they are kept separate from society for a while and are trained from youth how to think. And they get told various different stories of the gods, but it's never negative. There's no negativity, so that they completely believe what they're defending. There's no doubts in their mind whatsoever. And then you have the guardians. The guardians are the ones that are going to rule the state. These are young ones who are born, and they seem to have, or they're studied, and they have a propensity towards philosophy, for understanding the world, for being able to judge it and have insight. And they're the ones that are going to make the best decisions and rules for the city-state. But to stop them just being in power, they can have children, but the children are not kept with them, because otherwise there'd be nepotism. And they're kept isolated in a commune, so that they don't get to wield authority over everybody. This is a really dumbed down version, but that's pretty much the layout of the Republic as Plato sees it. And of course he expands on that, and there's loads of things that can be said. But that idea has repeated itself through Western thought in particular. Many of the ideas that you read on types of government, there's a certain Platonic undertone from the Republic. So maybe he was onto something, but there are some deep flaws in it as well. Our third book is also from a Greek philosopher, because they were really good at thinking about things, and that's Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, you can pick many things from his. Ethics is probably what most people would pick as the most influential book, but I'm going to go for a different one, and that's his discussion of rhetoric. He laid pretty much the first organised ideas of how to use rhetoric in speaking in the public forum, the public discourse. And of course, again, like Euclid, he didn't just come up with everything on his own. There were other speakers around him, but he collected it in a unified form of thought. Very dry to read, but boy, is it influential in society, because the force behind every major movement and activity in life is the force of speech. And the people that have moved empires, the people that have roused followers, are those that can speak. And rhetoric is speaking in its highest art form. The ability to reason logically, to appeal to the emotions, and to have a gravitas as well of background. It's logos, pathos and ethos, which is what Aristotle talks about in rhetoric. And it's studied to this day. It is the grounding of the study of rhetoric. When you hear a president give a speech, I think of Barack Obama, that is written sometimes partly by the president, but it goes through a team of rhetoricians who examine it to structure it so that it has the maximum impact, so that it enters smoothly into people's minds, so that it's full of grand vision, images, metaphors being used. There's so many things, and you're going to see a lot of this in the Renaissance. Shakespeare in particular, there's so much rhetoric that is used in his grand soliloquies, and that comes not just from Aristotle, but that's the formation of it. And that's why I picked that over his ethics, is because speech, really, speech in the written word, which is just another form of speech on paper, is the most powerful thing in human existence. And hence why people talk about the need to protect freedom of speech, because crushing speech means to crush every idea. Our fourth book on the list is non-fiction. And it's the complete works of Shakespeare. And I do appreciate I have now jumped centuries, well, over a millennia, from the Greeks to Shakespeare. And there's plenty of influential books in that time. But we're jumping to Shakespeare right now because he has a huge effect on society around us. It's one of the reasons I think he should always be taught at school, even if he is sometimes hard to get into. And if you want to get into Shakespeare, check out my playlist on Shakespeare Explained, where you'll get videos on how to get into Shakespeare, how to read Shakespeare, and have soliloquies explained line by line. But Shakespeare has had an enormous effect on our society. It's had an effect on art, for a start, but most of all, our perception of what it means to be human is inextricably linked to Shakespeare's plays. Whether that's the histories, the comedies, or the tragedies. The tragedies obviously get most attention, but what Shakespeare does is he had this negative capacity. In other words, the capacity to imagine himself in another person's body and to feel as they felt. But he could put it in such a way that you find yourself in it. Just certain revelations of the human condition. And a proof of how successful it is that his works cross all cultural bounds. You will find Shakespeare's plays the whole world over. And that's not to do with Britain's empire. It's because they're still produced today because he sort of captured what humanity is. You know, he's a humanist. Particularly, his sense of belonging and smallness in space and time. Time is the thing that Shakespeare brings to the fore more than anything else. All of his plays, to a degree, deal with time and our microscopic place on the scale. You know, you think of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow as an example. But on top of that, you know, what makes us, we are such stuff as dreams are made of, is another of his famous quotes. Our little strutting upon the stage, you know, all the world's a stage. And it's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing. The capturing of the sublime as experienced by humans, no one did it quite like Shakespeare. And it has echoed through all of literature, all of art, and it's influenced philosophies as well. And so that's why he's on our list in number 4. The 5th book on our list is a book that's controversial, but it shouldn't be controversial in this list, no matter what your opinion is of it. And it is the Bible. Specifically, I'm talking about the King James translation, because it was only when the Bible was opened up to the vulgar tongue, the common languages of all the countries of Europe, that its ideas and messages and undertones and famous quotes began to really take hold of society, because the everyday person could latch onto it. And of course, it was already at that point automatically viewed as the word of God, okay? And so obviously it's going to be implemented in society, and huge. All the strata of society is influenced by the Bible, specifically the King James. Now, I'm not saying it is God's word in this video. I'm not saying it's a load of rubbish. There's no need to be vitriolic about this or overly dogmatic. We're just looking at its place in society. I had somebody say on one of my comments that it's never affected law because I made that comment. Yes, it has. You know, whether you want to accept it for what it claims to be or not, its impact is enormous. And speaking of law, for instance, you know, the Declaration of Independence, and then from that you get the Constitution built out. You think of the famous phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, the pursuit of freedom and liberty and happiness. That is inextricably linked, for instance, to the Bible, the understanding of the Bible. It's funny because it's not, what did they say at the beginning? We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's not a self-evident truth. Evidence of that, when I spent years studying the ancient past, ancient religions didn't have that idea. And so the founding fathers unwittingly had already taken society of its day for granted. So these truths are self-evident, but that's a biblical statement. And, you know, it's had an impact. It's also been used to sponsor some of the most egregious crimes in humanity. It's been used to justify warfare and cause mass bloodshed. It's also a book that was the cornerstone for the abolitionist movement on slavery. It was the evangelicals that were mainly behind it, using the Bible as God's word to change things. So this book is extremely influential. There's no other book that is quite as influential on Western thought as the Bible. Our sixth book on the list is absolutely monumental in the formation of the world we inhabit today, and via the West it has become the whole world, and it's Adam Smith's On the Wealth of Nations, a treatise on capitalism, explaining how a capitalistic society will generate wealth for the society at large. Adam Smith, it's a shame he wrote such a fantastic book, and I'm not saying, again, this is not to say capitalism is right or whether it's the devil's work. That's not the point. This is about, is it influential? And yes, we live in a capitalistic world, and right at the rockbed, amongst the foundation stones that build it, is Adam Smith's On the Wealth of Nations. He argues that when wealth is made and people are utilised, rather than doing everything themselves, sewing your own clothes, cooking your own bread, making your own furniture, if people are trained to do things they're good at and work on parts of life, and we create commerce, the actual levels of luxury in society will go up. And as they go up, people will be happier. Those who particularly do well have a right to earn capital and to become more important. But they will invest that money back into society, funding things like hospitals, making sufficient money to pay for the poor. Because without wealth coming into the nation, the poor would just be left scrabbling around. Also, that money will be put into public works to beautify cities and towns in order to make it pleasurable for everyone to live in it. He argued against overtaxing the rich because they would leave the country and with them would go their money, and actually everyone would be poorer. By the way, I'm not saying I agree with this. This is just his argument. What he said was the capitalists need to appeal to vanity. The rich, there's only so much money you can actually spend, but what they truly want is to be admired. They want position. Now, of course, there is a problem with this, that if you take the vanity to a certain level, vanity is pride and it will come to power. And of course, we see the problems with capitalism today, but nonetheless, it was a well-worked argument and had a massive, massive impact on the way that nations generated wealth. And through wealth, one of the biggest weaknesses of it comes empire. You need money if you're going to actually conquer places. It's not the greatest military might that wins a war, it's wealth. And it's no accident that it's the wealthy Western nations that ended up using that wealth to dominate. A big problem in capitalism. So that's the next book. A huge impact which we still live in the society, which in essence is based on Adam Smith's On the Wealth of Nations. One little comment though. What a shame writing such an influential work and having such a dull name. Adam Smith. I mean, he could have changed it, couldn't he? Seventh, I think we're on our list, is a monumental work of political philosophy which gave birth to a great deal of ideas and movements over the past 2 centuries, and that is Thomas Paine's Declaration on the Rights of Man. Thomas Paine, one of the forgotten founding fathers, he was very much in favour of the French Revolution. And at the time of the French Revolution, right at the beginning, the English commentator Edmund Burke gave his book, The Meditations on the French Revolution. Now, he wrote this in 1890, Edmund Burke did. And he foresaw the problems that would take place with the French Revolution if they just tore down all the industry, all the institutions around them, and the vacuum of power it would leave. Very fascinating, considering he wrote all of his observations before the French Revolution got out of control. Thomas Paine did not like this, and he wanted to support the people in their right to overturn an oppressive regime. So in 1791, he writes the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is so popular in France. It gives words to the ideals of the revolution. He is a celebrated figure, although when the revolution turns a bit later, he's put in prison for 10 months and almost loses his head. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man shows the position of the state to the people in it, the role they have towards each other, that the state should serve the people, it should be a representative of the people, but also how the people have to follow the state. And we're talking about setting up congresses rather than having the aristocratic court, and that being ruled by the whim of a monarch, and just inherited monarchy. The divine right of kings is actually an abomination when it comes to the governance of humans. And his ideas, of course, were very influential. He had come from the American Revolution himself, and the French absolutely loved it. And again, in a lot of his principles, he was quite radical, but at the same time he could also be moderate, because as the French Revolution got out of control, he tried to say that's not really what the rights of man are. What you're doing is, corrupting the process. And then that's when the revolution turned on him as a traitor. But the ideas he places, the separation of church and state, which would get rid of the divine right of kings, for instance, that is something that sticks with us today. There's that separation. Strictly speaking, Britain isn't a separation of church and state, because the head of the country, the king, is also the head of the Church of England. However, in practice, it's pretty much separated. And we've got the Declaration of the Rights of Man as probably one of the greatest works to influence those decisions and founding democracy, like taking it on to another level. So it had a massive effect on the society. The eighth book on our list is an extraordinarily dry book, and that is John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. This is an ethical work and a philosophical work about the idea, the ethical utilitarianism, and how, again, society should be organised. Now, John Stuart Mill's, in short, and it's something I'm not fully conversant with, it's quite difficult to get through at times in the way it's all written. But the idea is, with utilitarianism, that we work for utility, we work for the greater happiness principle, that we move towards pleasure and we move away from pain, that true happiness is a maximising of pleasure over all and getting rid of the most amount of pain overall. He wasn't the first to come up with this. Jeremy Bentham really called the father of utilitarianism, but he constructed an argument and answered a lot of the critics to this way of thinking. Now, the reason this is so influential is even today, most things in society now are ethically judged on whether it has the greatest benefit for the happiness of society, and that the individual, in principle, the idea works for them as well, but that they do become lesser to the whole group. You can't just do something that makes you really happy, which is detrimental to the society overall. That would add more pain than it would happiness, and hence you wouldn't do that. Now, this idea has come under criticism from many quarters, but it really took a strong hold in the 19th century. And various forms of utilitarianism broke out, and placing people in the place which gives the maximum production for society is something that you did use. And not that Stuart Mill was in favour of this, but you think of utilitarianism when it comes to the workhouses, to the cotton mills, to industry. Everyone's contributing to the nation, but actually a lot of people are miserable. And that's not strictly how John Stuart Mill envisaged it, but like lots of philosophies, good in theory, hard to put into practice. And the interesting thing about that, in fact, the Declaration of Rights of Man as well, is there's this echo of Plato's Republic in the background, an idea of setting everybody up to bring about the greatest kind of utopian vision. One of the main critics of a out-of-control utilitarianism, of course, was Charles Dickens in his book Hard Times. He's pretty much attacking the idea of utilitarianism, and that the subjection of the individual, you can argue it on paper, but it often makes a lot of people unhappy. But nonetheless, an enormously influential work on the way particularly the governing classes began to perceive society and try to get society to work as best as it possibly could. The ninth book on our list is a real groundbreaker and shook the world's foundations, the Western world's anyway, and that is Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species. Without trying to refer all scientific matters back to God, Darwin came up with a method by which biology could proceed from a small beginning into all the amazing stuff that we see around us today, by a process of evolution and branching out, of famous Darwin's tree of life. He said there is a wonder in seeing life as this way, that something so small, an initial burst of life, would spread and evolve into its various different parts based on the environment, based on natural selection, which is the great idea behind the origin of the species, this natural mode of actually accounting for life without incurring miracles at all stages. The impact of it obviously changed science in a big way, partly because there's a philosophy in science which this particularly grew out of, and it matched, so it's going to be accepted. But what's so fascinating about the origin of the species when it comes to society as a whole is its societal impact. I think it was Richard Dawkins who said it was the origin of the species that made it possible for one to be an intellectual atheist. There was always arguments against it until natural selection came along and removed the need for a creator. Now, what I want to say here again, as I said about the Bible, this is not saying that he's absolutely right. Neither do we need to be like, well, I think he's against God, and so therefore I cannot possibly say that this book is good or that this book has had an influence in society. He's had a huge influence in society. So whichever way you view the ideas that are in there, and of course many of the ideas are now outmoded. Just of late, even natural selection is coming to be questioned, but you cannot, like any other book, you cannot understate the power and the change this made in the way that society has thought over time. It stands as one of the big movers of the way the West began to perceive the world that it was inhabiting, and of course that idea has spread to the whole world at large. The 10th book on our list should come as no surprise, because politically there's not many books that have shook the world quite like this, with maybe the exception of On the Wealth of Nations. And it's Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' The Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto is a really short book. It's actually quite easy to read. It's very well explained, very concise. And again, I'm not saying in this video whether communism and socialism is the best way to go or democracy. Nothing about that. It's just what books have shaped the world we inhabit. You cannot overlook the Communist Manifesto. Interesting again, there is hints of Platoism, the Republic, in this, the ordering of society. He breaks society mainly into two classes in this book. You have the bourgeoisie, that's the ruling classes, the rich classes, the merchant class. They're the ones that have the money and the charge. They're the landowners, essentially. And then you have the proletariat, which is a reference made to by George Orwell in 1984, when the people, the commoners who are nothing, they're called the proles. It's just the shortened form of proletariat, the unlanded and the poor. He says that all history is a struggle between these two classes. You could argue that. But what they advocate is working again for the greater good as a commune. What will bring the best? The abolishment of land ownership is the big thing behind this. There are a number of ideas, but that's one of the biggies. Because if people own land, they have power. The proletariat without land, they work, but what for? They never actually get anywhere with it. And so he says, get rid of all land. People will work for nothing anyway. They don't need to be incentivized to buy that, because the proletariat already proved they don't have land, but they work every day. And what will happen is, by nationalising all land and no one has private ownership of it, it can be allocated and shared to the best of all humanity, and the workers are no longer under the oppression of the bourgeoisie. And then it's monitored, because of course this relies on the premise that those who govern, which would be Plato's guardians, do it with the best interests of everybody. And of course, like Plato's Republic, one of the things that's a downside to it, and even with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, those in charge, are you going to get people who are in power who don't want to use it for themselves? That's always the argument levelled against these systems. But that's the Communist Manifesto. And there's a lot more involved in the Communist Manifesto. I've just given a brief précis of just one or two ideas. But its impact is absolutely huge. And gives rise in principle to some of the fine ideas that come behind socialism, which is the step you need to go through in order to get to full communism, where you even get rid of money. So that's the 10th book, the Communist Manifesto. Now we come to the 11th on our strangely numbered list. And I've put this one in because it actually was a dramatically influential book. With ideas which have spread globally, and it's a novel of all things. And it's the best-selling novel of the 19th century, which was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, where through novel format she helped the Western world understand the plight, the savagery of what black slaves were going through in America. She laid it bare, warts and all, as Oliver Cromwell would say. And it shocked people. It moved people. It really gave an impetus for the need to change now. The emancipationists had been working for some time, but this gave it real. It was like the last thing that just tipped over the edge. The apocryphal story that Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said, "So you're the little woman that started this war." It had a huge influence in the northern states of America and gave a moral impetus to the fight against the South and to get rid of slavery. Now, is it the most important work on slavery? Probably not. I mean, you've got to look at Frederick Douglass. His autobiography was just stunning, and that's a very worthwhile book to do on this channel. But the novel was just so effective because it spread, it just everywhere. It sold so many copies, and it came across as well into Europe, and it made the outcry that much stronger. And of course, the rest is history, in that we have the Civil War, and slavery is finally abolished in America. So yeah, you've got to put that down, and its principles and ideas in how we think of slavery even today, and that it is just outright wrong. And that's one of the many books, but it's like the spear tip on the end of a very much bigger movement. It's just she managed to capture it so well. She managed to capture the horror and to raise the indignation of people that it's now time to finish this abomination. So there are our 11 books that significantly shaped the Western world, and because of how history worked out, shapes the extended world as well. This was not meant to be an in-depth view of any of them in particular, so if you feel I've missed bits out about all of them or have not phrased it well, please don't take me up on that. That's not the point of the video. It's just to point people in the direction. If you want to know, or someone wants to know, what books really founded society, and you're prepared to read them, and remember, some of them are very, very tough going and dry, but if you're prepared to read them, you'll begin to get an understanding of how society sits as it is today. Until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.